Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of English literature into gripping radio. On today's episode, we're bringing you part 3 in our adaptation of In the Abyss, an 1898 work of early science fiction by the visionary author H.G. Wells. Our story centers on the exploits of the explorer Elstead, who is conducting an expedition with the Royal Navy that has seen him dive 8 kilometers down into the deep blackness and overwhelming pressures of the oceanic abyss in an experimental spherical steel bathysphere, a type of submersible designed for the crushing pressures of the deep. The journey was only expected to last for 35 minutes, but Elstead's friends and the crew aboard the waiting naval ship found themselves caught in suspense and growing horror as Elstead failed to reappear. Finally, long after midnight, as we return to the story in part 3, the crew of the Royal Navy cruiser Ptarmigan rushed to recover Elstead's submersible and learn his fate. The air was very hot within the cavity of the sphere, and the india rubber at the lip of the manhole was soft. There was no answer to their eager questions and no sound of movement within. Elstead seemed to be lying motionless, crumpled up in the bottom of the globe. The ship's doctor crawled in and lifted him out to the men outside. For a moment or so, they did not know whether Elstead was alive or dead. His face, in the yellow glow of the ship's lamps, glistened with perspiration. They carried him down to his own cabin. He was not dead, they found, but in a state of absolute nervous collapse, and besides, cruelly bruised. For some days he had to lie perfectly still. It was a week before he could tell his experiences. Almost his first words were that he was going down again. The sphere would have to be altered, he said, in order to allow him to throw off the cord himself if need be, and that was all. He had had the most marvelous experience. You thought I should find nothing but ooze. You laughed at my explorations, and I have discovered a new world. He told his story in disconnected fragments, and chiefly from the wrong end, so that it is impossible to retell it in his own words. But what follows is the narrative of his experience. It began atrociously, he said. Before the cord ran out, the sphere kept rolling over. He felt like a frog in a football. He could see nothing but the crane of the ship and the sky overhead, with an occasional glimpse of the people on the rail. He couldn't tell a bit which way the thing would roll next. Suddenly, he would find his feet going up and try to step, and over he went rolling, head over heels, and just anyhow on the padding. Any other shape would have been more comfortable, but no other shape was to be relied upon under the huge pressure of the nethermost abyss. Suddenly, the swaying ceased, the globe righted, and when he had picked himself up, he saw the water all about him, greeny blue with an attenuated light filtering down from above, and a shoal of little floating things went rushing up past him, as it seemed to him, towards the light. And even as he looked, it grew darker and darker, until the water above was as dark as the midnight sky, albeit of a greener shade, and the water below black. And little transparent things in the water developed a faint glint of luminosity and shot past him in faint greenish streaks, and the feeling of falling. It was just like the start of a lift, he said, only it kept on. One has to imagine what that means, that keeping on. It was then of all times that Elstead repented of his adventure. He saw the chances against him in an altogether new light. He thought of the big cuttlefish people knew to exist in the middle waters, the kind of things they find half-digested in whales at times, or floating dead and rotten and half-eaten by fish. Suppose one caught hold and wouldn't leave go. And had the clockwork really been sufficiently tested? But whether he wanted to go on or go back mattered not the slightest now. In 50 seconds, everything was as black as night outside, except where the beam from his light struck through the waters and picked out every now and then some fish or some scrap of sinking matter. They flashed by too fast for him to see what they were. Once he thought he passed a shark, and then the sphere began to get hot by friction against the water. They had underestimated this, it seems. The first thing he noticed was that he was perspiring, and then he heard a hissing, growing louder under his feet, and saw a lot of little bubbles, very little bubbles they were, rushing upward like a fan through the water outside. Steam. He felt the window, and it was hot. He turned on the minute glow lamp that lit his own cavity, looked at the padded watch by the studs, and saw he had been traveling now for 2 minutes. It came into his head that the window could crack from the conflict of temperatures, for he knew the bottom water was very near freezing. Then, suddenly, the floor of the sphere seemed to press against his feet. The rush of bubbles outside grew slower and slower, and the hissing diminished. The sphere rolled a little. The window had not cracked. Nothing had given, and he knew that the dangers of sinking, at any rate, were over. In another minute or so, he would be on the floor of the abyss. He thought, he said, of Stevens and Weybridge and the rest of them 5 miles overhead, higher to him than the very highest clouds that ever floated over land are to us, seeming slowly and staring down and wondering what had happened to him. He peered out of the window. There were no more bubbles now, and the hissing had stopped. Outside there was a heavy blackness, as black velvet, except where the electric light pierced the empty water and showed the color of it, a yellow-green. Then 3 things like shapes of fire swam into the light, following each other through the water. Whether they were little or near, or big and far off, he could not tell. Each was outlined in a bluish light almost as bright as the lights of a fishing smack, a light which seemed to be smoking greatly, and all along the sides of them were specks of this, like the lighted portholes of a ship. Their phosphorescence seemed to go out as they came into the radiance of his lamp, and he saw then that they were indeed fish of some strange sort, with huge heads, vast eyes, and dwindling bodies and tails. Their eyes were turned towards him, and he judged they were following him down. He supposed they were attracted by his glare. Presently others of the same sort joined them. As he went on down, he noticed that the water became of a pallid color, and that little specks twinkled in his ray like motes in a sunbeam. This was probably due to the clouds of ooze and mud that the impact of his leaden sinkers had disturbed. By the time he was drawn down to the lead weights, he was in a dense fog of white that his electric light failed altogether to pierce more than a few yards, and many minutes elapsed before the hanging sheets of sediment subsided to any extent. Then, lit by his light and by the transient phosphorescence of a distant shoal of fish, he was able to see under the huge blackness of the superincumbent water an undulating expanse of grayish-white ooze, broken here and there by tangled thickets of growth of sea lilies, waving hungry tentacles in the air. Further away were the graceful translucent outlines of a group of gigantic sponges. About this floor were scattered a large number of bristling, flattish tufts of rich purple and black, which he decided must be some sort of sea urchin, and small, large-eyed or blind things having a curious resemblance, some to woodlice and others to lobsters, crawled sluggishly across the track of the light and vanished into the obscurity again, leaving furrowed trails behind. Then, suddenly, the hovering swarm of little fishes veered about and came towards him, as a flight of starlings might do. They passed over him like phosphorescent snow, and then he saw, behind them, some larger creature advancing towards the sphere. As Elstead recounts his headlong plunge into the deepest reaches of the ocean, we're left to wonder at whatever unforeseen circumstance could have resulted in his remaining at the bottom of the ocean not for 35 minutes, but for hour after hour after hour, trapped in his steel sphere as the pressure bore down on it and his mechanism for the production of breathable oxygen ran down. What kept him there, and why has the intrepid scientist resolved so fearlessly to venture down again? And above all, what is this strange figure he has spotted approaching him through the tiny viewing window of his steel sphere? Find out tomorrow evening here on BeFM Drama as we bring you part 4 of H.G. Wells' classic work of science fiction, In the Abyss.